Malik's fingers tightened around the straps of his backpack as he stood in the narrow aisle, his heart pounding against his ribs. He felt the weight of every gaze in the first-class cabin pressing down on him. Silent judgments, whispered speculations, a wall of disinterest from people who could have spoken up but chose not to. Erin stood beside him, her posture stiff with authority, her outstretched arm motioning toward the back of the plane as if she were doing him a favor by not making a bigger scene. The businessman who had been seated next to Malik let out a quiet sigh, shifting his newspaper ever so slightly as if the mere presence of the situation was an inconvenience to him. The woman across the aisle, the one who had adjusted her sunglasses moments earlier, now kept her eyes fixed on the in-flight magazine, her fingers flipping a page she hadn't actually read. A few rows ahead, an older gentleman frowned but said nothing. Malik swallowed, his throat dry. "But my dad bought me this seat," he said again, his voice quieter this time. Not because he doubted himself, but because the embarrassment was starting to settle into his bones. He glanced at his ticket once more, just to make sure. Seat 2A, first class. It was right there, in black and white. Proof. Erin exhaled sharply, her patience wearing thin. "Sir, I need you to come with me now." Malik hesitated. His mind raced, trying to figure out what he had done wrong. He had boarded like everyone else. He had shown his ticket. He had followed every rule. So why was he the only one being asked to move? He looked toward the front of the plane where a flight attendant was handing a champagne flute to a middle-aged man who had just arrived in first class. The man wasn't asked to prove that he belonged. No one had checked his ticket twice. No one had questioned whether or not he was supposed to be here. Heat crawled up Malik's neck. What? Erin's lips pressed into a thin line, her voice dropping into something sterner, something that left no room for argument. "I'm not going to ask again." Malik exhaled sharply through his nose, then reached down and grabbed his backpack. His fingers trembled slightly as he slung it over his shoulder, his entire body tense with frustration and humiliation. He could feel the stairs following him, a silent spectacle unfolding in real time, and yet no one, not a single person, intervened. Erin turned and began walking toward the curtain that separated first class from economy, not bothering to look back, fully expecting him to follow without resistance. Malik took one last glance at the luxurious seat he had barely gotten to enjoy, before stepping into the aisle and following behind her. As he walked, he could hear it, the whispers, the hushed conversations. What was that about? I don't know, but he must not have belonged up here. They don't just move people for no reason. The words stung in a way that surprised him, cutting deeper than he expected. He had thought, for some reason, that at least one person would say something, that someone would ask Erin if she had double-checked before making him leave. But no one did. They just let it happen. He stepped through the curtain, entering the cramped, dimly lit economy section, where the contrast was almost jarring. The seats were smaller, the aisles narrower, and there was a distinct shift in atmosphere, more chaotic, less refined. A flight attendant in economy, a man in his late 30s with dark hair, glanced up as Malik passed. His brow furrowed slightly as if he was surprised to see a first-class passenger being sent back, but he didn't say anything either. Erin stopped near the middle of the economy section and gestured toward an empty aisle seat. "Here, you can sit here." Malik's stomach tightened. The seat wasn't even next to a window. He had picked his original seat in 2A specifically so he could watch the world disappear beneath the plane. He didn't move immediately. He knew it was pointless, but still, he said, "This isn't my seat." Erin stared at him, her patience almost completely gone. "It is now." Malik lowered himself into the seat, gripping the armrests tightly. His entire body felt hot with frustration, his face burning with a mix of anger and shame. He had never felt this way before, not like this. He had experienced unfair moments at school, had seen the way some teachers treated kids like him differently, but this was something else. His fingers clenched into fists in his lap. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And yet, it had happened. Erin turned without another word and walked back toward first class, disappearing behind the curtain like nothing had ever happened. But it had. And Malik wasn't just going to sit there and let it go. He reached for his phone, his fingers moving before he could second-guess himself. His father had told him to text the moment he landed, but this couldn't wait. Malik, they made me move to the back, said I couldn't sit in first class. I had my ticket. She didn't believe me. He stared at the message for a moment before pressing send. The reply came almost instantly. Dad, what do you mean they made you move? Who made you move? His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he typed back. Malik, the flight attendant, she said there was a mistake. She wouldn't listen. There was a pause, a long one, the kind that made Malik's stomach tighten because he could practically see the way his dad's expression must have changed when he read that last message. Then the response came. Dad, what's the flight number? Malik checked his boarding pass, his hand still shaking slightly, then typed out the number before hitting send. Another reply, this time almost immediate. Dad, stay where you are. Don't say anything else to her. I'll handle it. Malik swallowed, his throat tight. His father wasn't a man who panicked easily. He was calm, controlled, precise, and that was what made this moment feel different. This wasn't over, not even close. Before we dive deeper into the story, I want to know, where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below, and if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Let's get back to it. JFK International Airport buzzed with its usual rhythm, a steady pulse of movement and anticipation as travelers navigated the vast terminal. The overhead departure boards flickered with glowing letters announcing flights bound for cities around the world, while the distant hum of intercom announcements blended with the murmur of conversations and the rolling of luggage wheels against polished tile floors. Flight 1287, a high-end commercial flight operated by Skywave Airlines, stood at Gate 23, its sleek silver fuselage gleaming under the harsh glow of airport floodlights. Bound for Los Angeles, the aircraft was one of the airline's newest models, boasting an opulent first-class section with fully reclining seats, private entertainment screens, and gourmet dining. Inside the boarding area, passengers clustered near the gate, their faces illuminated by phone screens as they checked last-minute emails or scrolled through social media. A group of sharply dressed business professionals stood in a small huddle, discussing stock prices and upcoming deals in hushed yet urgent tones. Nearby, a young couple wrangled their twin toddlers, trying to coax them into their seats before boarding was called. An older woman, draped in a cashmere shawl, sipped from a to-go coffee cup as she read a well-worn novel, her silver hair neatly pinned back. The air smelled of fresh-brewed espresso from the airport cafe and the faint scent of jet fuel that wafted in every time the automatic doors slid open. At the front of the line, a middle-aged man wearing a tailored navy suit glanced impatiently at his Rolex, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as he exhaled in frustration. First-class passengers were already being called to board, and he clearly had somewhere important to be. Flight attendants stood at the entrance to the jet bridge, their smiles polished and professional as they scanned tickets and directed travelers inside. As the priority passengers made their way through, the energy inside the aircraft shifted from the rushed chaos of the terminal to the structured calm of the cabin. Soft lighting illuminated the plush interior, casting a warm glow over the sleek leather seats in first class. The scent of fresh linen and citrus-scented sanitizer lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of vanilla from the welcome drinks being prepared. Overhead compartments clicked shut as travelers settled into their seats, adjusting headrests and plugging in noise-canceling headphones. A flight attendant in a perfectly pressed uniform moved gracefully down the aisle, offering champagne to those already seated. A businessman in his early 40s, dressed in an impeccable gray suit, reclined slightly in seat 1A, scrolling through emails on his tablet while absent-mindedly swirling a glass of sparkling water. Across from him, a woman in an elegant black dress adjusted her designer handbag in the seat beside her before slipping off her heels and curling her legs beneath her, her perfectly manicured fingers flipping through a glossy fashion magazine. The hum of polite conversation filled the first-class section, but there was an unspoken hierarchy. Travelers here kept to themselves, exchanging nods of acknowledgement but rarely engaging in idle chatter. The atmosphere was one of quiet luxury, a world separate from the bustling energy of the main cabin. Further back, in the economy section, the tone was entirely different. Passengers jostled for overhead bin space, stuffing carry-ons into tight compartments while others squeezed past each other in the narrow aisle. A college student, dressed in a hoodie and sweatpants, slumped into his seat with his earbuds already in, oblivious to the chaos around him. A mother struggled to lift a diaper bag into the overhead bin while her baby whimpered in her arms. A man in a baseball cap sighed loudly as he tried to maneuver past a row of occupied seats, mumbling an apology as he accidentally bumped into someone's elbow. Despite the contrast in experience, everyone shared the same destination, Los Angeles, a city promising new beginnings, business deals, family reunions, or simply another step in life's ongoing journey. For one passenger, however, this flight would be more than just another trip. Malik Carter, a 12-year-old boy with a bright mind and an even brighter future, clutched his boarding pass in his hand as he approached the gate. His dark brown eyes flickered with excitement, though he kept his expression composed, determined to appear as mature as possible. Dressed in a crisp white t-shirt beneath a zip-up NASA hoodie, he carried himself with quiet confidence. This was his first time flying alone, a reward from his father for his exceptional academic performance, and he wanted to prove that he was responsible enough to handle it. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, he inhaled deeply, taking in the faint metallic scent of the aircraft ahead. The flight attendants greeted him with a polite but slightly distracted smile, their focus primarily on the wealthier travelers who had yet to board. Unbothered, Malik adjusted his backpack straps and walked down the aisle, his fingers brushing over the smooth leather headrests as he counted the row numbers in his head. He stopped at seat 2A, his seat, first class. He grinned to himself before quickly composing his expression again, not wanting to look too excited. As he settled in, he leaned back, absorbing the comfort of the spacious seat, and gazed out the oval window, watching the twinkling airport lights outside. He had never felt more independent, more capable. This trip wasn't just a flight, it was a symbol of his hard work, his father's belief in him, and the limitless possibilities ahead. But what Malik didn't know was that in just a few minutes, his excitement would be shattered, that his very presence in this seat would be questioned, that the quiet privilege surrounding him in first class would be weaponized against him, and that before this flight landed, justice would be served in a way no one on this plane could have predicted. Malik adjusted his backpack on his lap, fingers tracing the edges of his ticket as he read the seat assignment once more. 2A, first class. He had checked it at least 5 times already, but it felt surreal. His father had told him he'd earned this, but sitting there, surrounded by luxury, Malik still felt a flicker of disbelief. He had worked hard for this trip, pulling late nights studying, acing his exams, proving he was responsible enough to fly alone. His dad had promised him a reward, and true to his word, he had handed him this ticket with a proud smile. Malik had never felt prouder of himself. He tugged at the sleeves of his NASA hoodie, the fabric soft and worn in all the right places. It was his favorite. His dad had bought it for him on their last trip to the Space Center in Houston, where he had stared in awe at the giant Saturn V rocket and listened to former astronauts talk about their journeys beyond Earth's atmosphere. That was the dream. Space, zero gravity, the unknown. He had imagined himself floating inside a spacecraft, weightless, untethered from the world below. But today, this was as close as he was going to get, a flight 35000 feet above the ground. It wasn't space, but it was still his first solo adventure, and that counted for something. He exhaled slowly, settling into the plush first-class seat, the leather cool against his arms. The seat was wide, way bigger than the ones he usually sat in when he flew with his dad, and there was so much legroom he could stretch out completely if he wanted. The little touchscreen embedded in the armrest showed movies he actually wanted to watch, and there was even a menu, a real menu, with meals that had actual names instead of just chicken or pasta. A flight attendant in a neat uniform moved through the aisle offering pre-flight drinks. She barely glanced at him, handing the businessman beside him a glass of champagne while ignoring Malik completely. He didn't mind, though. He wasn't sure if he was even allowed to have anything yet. Instead, he focused on the window, watching the baggage handlers below maneuver carts loaded with suitcases, and the flashing lights of airport vehicles moving across the tarmac in careful coordination. The world felt bigger from here, more connected. A voice cut through the quiet murmur of passengers settling in. "Excuse me, young man," a woman's voice said, firm and clipped. Malik turned to see a flight attendant standing over him, arms crossed, expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp with something he couldn't quite name. She was tall, her uniform pristine, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun. Her name tag read Erin Blake. Malik blinked, straightening in his seat. "Yes, ma'am?" Erin's gaze flicked from him to his ticket, then back to him again. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Her voice was polite but with an unmistakable edge, like she already knew the answer she wanted. Malik nodded quickly, holding up his ticket. "Yes, ma'am. Seat 2A." She took the ticket from his hand, barely looking at it before shaking her head. "This is a first-class seat." "I know," Malik said, confusion creeping into his voice. "Where are your parents?" she asked. Malik hesitated. "I'm traveling alone." Her posture stiffened at that, as if that answer confirmed something for her. "I see," she said, handing the ticket back. "Unfortunately, there must have been a mistake. This seat is reserved for first-class passengers only." His stomach twisted. "But I am a first-class passenger," he said carefully. Her smile was tight, forced, dismissive. "I think there's been some confusion. You need to take your things and move to economy." Heat rose up Malik's neck. He felt every pair of eyes in first class glance at him, then quickly look away. The businessman in the seat beside him shifted uncomfortably, pretending to read his newspaper. The woman across the aisle adjusted her sunglasses, sneaking a glance but saying nothing. No one spoke up. Malik hesitated, gripping his backpack tighter. He had done nothing wrong. He wasn't loud. He wasn't causing trouble. He wasn't even arguing he had a ticket. This was his seat. And yet, here he was. Slowly, reluctantly, he reached for his backpack and stood up, his legs unsteady. The cabin whispers in the cabin grew quieter, the weight of judgment pressing against his shoulders. Erin didn't offer to help, didn't even pretend to be apologetic. She simply turned and motioned toward the back of the plane. "Right this way." As he walked past the rows of first-class passengers, Malik kept his gaze forward, refusing to look at any of them. If they weren't going to speak up, he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing how much this moment stung. From behind the curtain separating first class from economy, another flight attendant watched everything. Nicole's grip tightened around the tray of drinks she was holding, her jaw clenching as she took in what just happened. She had been working this job long enough to recognize exactly what Erin had just done. She had seen it before, with different passengers in different ways, the extra scrutiny, the assumptions, the unspoken belief that some people just didn't belong in first class. Her hands shook as she set down the tray in the galley, swallowing the urge to say something. Erin had been with the airline for over 15 years. She was respected, authoritative. Nicole was still new. She knew better than to challenge someone with more experience, especially in front of passengers. But that didn't make it sit any better. She exhaled sharply, trying to push the unease away. This wasn't right, but what was she supposed to do? Malik's fingers tightened around the straps of his backpack as he stood in the narrow aisle, his heart pounding against his ribs. He felt the weight of every gaze in the first-class cabin pressing down on him, silent judgments, whispered speculations, a wall of disinterest from people who could have spoken up but chose not to. Erin stood beside him, her posture stiff with authority, her outstretched arm motioning toward the back of the plane as if she were doing him a favor by not making a bigger scene. The businessman who had been seated next to Malik let out a quiet sigh, shifting his newspaper ever so slightly, as if the mere presence of the situation was an inconvenience to him. The woman across the aisle, the one who had adjusted her sunglasses moments earlier, now kept her eyes fixed on the in-flight magazine, her fingers flipping a page she hadn't actually read. A few rows ahead, an older gentleman frowned, but said nothing. Malik swallowed, his throat dry. "But my dad bought me this seat," he said again, his voice quieter this time, not because he doubted himself, but because the embarrassment was starting to settle into his bones. He glanced at his ticket once more just to make sure. Seat 2A, first class. It was right there, in black and white. Erin exhaled sharply, her patience wearing thin. "Sir, I need you to come with me now." Malik hesitated. His mind raced, trying to figure out what he had done wrong. He had boarded like everyone else. He had shown his ticket. He had followed every rule. So why was he the only one being asked to move? He looked toward the front of the plane, where a flight attendant was handing a champagne flute to a middle-aged man who had just arrived in first class. The man wasn't asked to prove that he belonged. No one had checked his ticket twice. No one had questioned whether or not he was supposed to be here. Heat crawled up Malik's neck. But Erin's lips pressed into a thin line, her voice dropping into something sterner, something that left no room for argument. "I'm not going to ask again." Malik exhaled sharply through his nose, then reached down and grabbed his backpack. His fingers trembled slightly as he slung it over his shoulder, his entire body tense with frustration and humiliation. He could feel the stares following him, a silent spectacle unfolding in real time, and yet no one, not a single person, intervened. Erin turned and began walking toward the curtain that separated first class from economy, not bothering to look back, fully expecting him to follow without resistance. Malik took one last glance at the luxurious seat he had barely gotten to enjoy before stepping into the aisle and following behind her. As he walked, he could hear it. The whispers, the hushed conversations. What was that about? "I don't know, but he must not have belonged up here." They don't just move people for no reason. The words stung in a way that surprised him, cutting deeper than he expected. He had thought, for some reason, that at least one person would say something, that someone would ask Erin if she had double-checked before making him leave. But no one did. They just let it happen. He stepped through the curtain, entering the cramped, dimly lit economy section, where the contrast was almost jarring. The seats were smaller, the aisles narrower, and there was a distinct shift in atmosphere, more chaotic, less refined. A flight attendant in economy, a man in his late 30s with dark hair, glanced up as Malik passed. His brow furrowed slightly as if he was surprised to see a first-class passenger being sent back, but he didn't say anything either. Erin stopped near the middle of the economy section and gestured toward an empty aisle seat. "Here, you can sit here." Malik's stomach tightened. The seat wasn't even next to a window. He had picked his original seat in 2A specifically so he could watch the world disappear beneath the plane. He didn't move immediately. He knew it was pointless, but still, he said, "This isn't my seat." Erin stared at him, her patience almost completely gone. "It is now." Malik lowered himself into the seat, gripping the armrests tightly. His entire body felt hot with frustration, his face burning with a mix of anger and shame. He had never felt this way before, not like this. He had experienced unfair moments at school, had seen the way some teachers treated kids like him differently, but this was something else. His fingers clenched into fists in his lap. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And yet, it had happened. Erin turned without another word and walked back toward first class, disappearing behind the curtain like nothing had ever happened. But it had. And Malik wasn't just going to sit there and let it go. He reached for his phone, his fingers moving before he could second-guess himself. His father had told him to text the moment he landed, but this couldn't wait. "Malik, they made me move to the back, said I couldn't sit in first class. I had my ticket." She didn't believe me. He stared at the message for a moment before pressing send. The reply came almost instantly. "Dad, what do you mean they made you move? Who made you move?" His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he typed back. "Mali, the flight attendant. She said there was a mistake. She wouldn't listen." There was a pause, a long one, the kind that made Malik's stomach tighten because he could practically see the way his dad's expression must have changed when he read that last message. Then the response came. "Dad, what's the flight number?" Malik checked his boarding pass, his hand still shaking slightly, then typed out the number before hitting send. Another reply, this time almost immediate. "Dad, stay where you are. Don't say anything else to her. I'll handle it." Malik swallowed, his throat tight. His father wasn't a man who panicked easily. He was calm, controlled, precise, and that was what made this moment feel different. This wasn't over. Not even close. Malik clenched his jaw as he stepped past the last row of first-class seats, the thick carpet beneath his sneakers muffling his movements, but nothing could mute the murmurs that followed him. The voices weren't loud, barely above a whisper, but they sliced through the air, sharp and undeniable. Figures first class isn't for kids like him. His steps faltered for a fraction of a second, but he forced himself to keep moving, his grip tightening on the straps of his backpack. He didn't turn to see who had said it. He didn't need to. The words weren't meant for him to respond to, only to remind him that they had already made up their minds about why he had been asked to leave. From the corner of his eye, he caught the businessman who had been sitting next to him in 2A lowering his newspaper, only to quickly avert his gaze the moment Malik glanced in his direction. His expression remained neutral, but his avoidance spoke volumes. He had seen what happened. He had been right there when Aaron took Malik's ticket and dismissed it like it was worthless, and yet he hadn't said a word. A few steps ahead, a woman with perfectly styled hair and an expensive-looking pearl bracelet glanced at her child, then subtly shifted in her seat, pulling the little girl closer to her side. It was an instinctive movement, barely noticeable, but Malik saw it, the way her fingers curled around her daughter's wrist just a little tighter, the way her shoulders stiffened ever so slightly as he passed by, like he was a threat, like she had to protect her kid from him. A lump formed in Malik's throat, but he swallowed it down, blinking hard as he focused straight ahead. The urge to turn around, to say something, to ask why, burned in his chest, but he knew it wouldn't matter. These people had already decided who he was. It didn't matter that he was 12 years old, that he had aced every one of his exams, that he had been taught to be respectful, to follow rules, to hold his head high. To them, all that mattered was what they saw. And what they saw didn't belong in first class. As he reached the curtain that separated the first-class cabin from the rest of the plane, he hesitated, gripping the fabric for just a moment before pushing through. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. First class had been quiet, controlled, suffocatingly sterile. But here, in economy, everything was louder, cramped, filled with restless movement. A man in a hoodie was already half asleep in his seat, arms crossed, earbuds in. A mother struggled to settle her crying toddler while balancing a bottle in one hand and digging through her diaper bag with the other. A teenage boy sat slouched near the aisle, tapping mindlessly on his phone, his foot bouncing impatiently against the floor. The contrast was stark, like stepping into an entirely different world. "Hey kid," a man in a baseball cap said as Malik passed by, nodding toward the backpack slung over his shoulder. "Where are you coming from?" Malik hesitated before answering, shifting his weight. "First class." The man let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "You'd think they let kids fly up there alone." Malik's stomach twisted, but he said nothing. He just kept walking. He could still feel the stares. Not from everyone, but enough. Some people looked at him with pity, like they knew what had just happened and felt bad, but not enough to say anything. Others looked at him with curiosity, as if they were trying to figure out what he could have possibly done to get himself sent back here. Only a few didn't seem to care at all. As he reached the seat Aaron had directed him to, he dropped into it, his body tense, his mind still replaying everything that had just happened. The whispers, the stares, the feeling of being dismissed not just by the flight attendant, but by an entire section of people who had chosen silence. His fingers hovered over his phone screen for a long moment before he finally unlocked it and typed out a message. It made me move to the back, said I couldn't sit in first class. I had my ticket, she didn't believe me. He sent it before he could second-guess himself. The reply came almost instantly. "What do you mean they made you move? Who made you move?" His father's words were sharp, clipped, controlled, but Malik could sense the anger beneath them. He hesitated before responding. "The flight attendant, she said there was a mistake. She wouldn't listen." For a few seconds, there was no reply. Then the dots appeared on the screen, the ones that meant his dad was typing. 5 seconds, 10. Then a message popped up. What's the flight number? Moloch's heart pounded as he checked his boarding pass, his hand still shaking slightly as he typed out the numbers and hit send. The next response was immediate. Stay where you are. Don't say anything else to her. I'll handle it. Malik exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tighter. He didn't know exactly what his father meant by that, but something in those words told him this wasn't over. Not even close. Nicole tightened her grip on the stack of drink menus she had been organizing in the galley, her fingers pressing into the glossy paper. She had seen everything. The way Aaron had walked over to the kid with that sharp, assessing look. The way she had dismissed his ticket without even checking the manifest. And worst of all, the way he had been forced to walk through that aisle, past all those staring faces, like he was guilty of something. Her stomach twisted uncomfortably. It wasn't the first time she had witnessed something like this. In her 2 years as a flight attendant, she had seen the way certain passengers were questioned more, treated differently, subtly nudged into compliance under the guise of following protocol. But this time, it felt worse. The boy was just a kid, sitting quietly, excited for his flight, and in an instant, he had been made to feel like he didn't belong. Nicole exhaled through her nose, trying to steady the frustration building in her chest. The small galley was tucked between first class and economy, a thin, closed-off space where the attendants prepped drinks and organized meals. Erin stood at the counter, perfectly composed, adjusting the cuffs of her uniform with the same cool precision she always had, as if she hadn't just humiliated a child in front of an entire cabin of people. Nicole hesitated for half a second, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Aaron, why didn't you check the system? He had a valid ticket. Aaron didn't even flinch. She didn't look guilty or unsure, didn't pause for even a second. Instead, she waved a dismissive hand in the air, as if brushing off an insignificant detail. Trust me, she said, smoothing down the front of her uniform. I know who belongs in first class. Nicole's jaw clenched. The casual confidence in Aaron's voice made something hot flare in Nicole's chest. Aaron wasn't just justifying herself. She genuinely believed she had made the right call, that she had done her job correctly. Nicole gripped the edge of the counter, willing herself to keep her voice level. But you didn't even check. I didn't need to. Aaron finally turned to look at her, her expression unreadable but firm. I've been doing this for 15 years. You learn to recognize when something's off. Nicole stared at her, barely keeping her disbelief in check. Something was off? She repeated, her voice quieter now, but filled with barely contained frustration. Aaron let out a soft, humorless laugh, reaching for a stack of neatly folded napkins. Come on, Nicole. We both know how this works. You think a 12-year-old is buying a first-class ticket on his own? She arched a perfectly shaped brow. Someone probably put him in the wrong seat. I just saved us the hassle of sorting it out mid-flight. Nicole felt physically ill. She knew there was no mistake. She had seen his boarding pass. Malik had been sitting there exactly where he was supposed to be, but Aaron had taken one look at him and decided without any verification that he didn't belong. Nicole opened her mouth, ready to push back, ready to say something, but then she stopped herself. The weight of reality settled over her like a heavy fog. Aaron had been with the airline for over 15 years. She was respected, well-connected, the kind of flight attendant who could make or break someone's career if she wanted to. Nicole, on the other hand, had been here for barely 2 years. She was still trying to make a name for herself, still trying to prove that she could handle the job. If she spoke up, if she really confronted Aaron about this, she wasn't just going against a coworker. She was going against someone with influence. And people like Aaron, they didn't get in trouble. People like Nicole did. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, frustration and helplessness battling inside her. She had always thought she would be the kind of person to stand up in a situation like this. She had promised herself that if she ever saw something unfair, something wrong, she wouldn't just let it happen. But here she was, doing exactly that. She hated herself for it. Nicole turned back to the trays, forcing herself to focus on busy work. Aaron took the silence as agreement, giving a satisfied nod before moving to the front of first class, to continue her usual duties as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just stripped a child of his dignity for no reason at all. Nicole's chest felt tight. She needed to do something. She just didn't know what. Malik sat stiffly in the economy seat, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. His backpack sat untouched on his lap, the weight of it pressing down as heavily as the heat burning in his chest. The narrow seat felt suffocating compared to the wide, comfortable space he had occupied just minutes ago. The armrests were scratched, the legroom almost non-existent, and the hum of conversation around him blurred into white noise. None of it mattered. The only thing he could think about was the humiliation that still burned through him, the weight of the silent stares as he had walked past rows of people who had watched him be dismissed without question. His fingers hovered over the screen, the words forming in his head before he even realized he was typing them out. Malik, they made me move to the back, said I couldn't sit in first class. I had my ticket. She didn't believe me. He stared at the message for a long second, his heart hammering in his chest. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he hit send. The response came almost instantly. Dad, what do you mean they made you move? Who made you move? Malik swallowed hard, his stomach twisting. He could almost hear his father's voice in his head, that calm, steady tone shifting into something sharper, something that didn't tolerate injustice. His dad wasn't the type to explode in anger, but when something was wrong, truly wrong, he handled it. Milakity, the flight attendant, she said there was a mistake. She wouldn't listen. A long pause. The dots blinked on the screen, then disappeared. 5 seconds, 10. Then a message appeared. Dad, it ain't. What's the flight number? Malik's breath caught. His father didn't ask unnecessary questions. He didn't demand explanations. He moved straight to fixing the problem. Malik checked the boarding pass still crumpled in his hoodie pocket, his hands shaking slightly as he typed out the flight number and sent it. The reply was immediate. Dad, stay where you are. Don't say anything else to her. I'll handle it. Malik exhaled, his pulse still pounding. His dad was handling it. That should have been enough to settle him. But the embarrassment still sat heavy in his chest, a sharp and unshakable reminder that even when you followed the rules, even when you did everything right, some people still saw you as less than. Across the country, in a sleek glass-walled office overlooking downtown Los Angeles, Desmond Carter's entire demeanor shifted the second he read the message. His back, which had been relaxed against the executive leather chair, straightened. His fingers curled slowly around the edge of his desk, the muscles in his jaw tightening as he read and reread the words on the screen. Malik's words played in his head, looping over and over, in a way that set his blood boiling in a way few things ever had. He was a man who had built his career on staying composed under pressure. He didn't yell. He didn't lose control. That was how he had built Skywave Airlines into one of the most respected names in the industry. But right now, every instinct in him told him to burn the entire plane down with his rage alone. He took a slow, measured breath, tapping a single button on his desk phone. His assistant picked up on the second ring. Mr. Carter, get me the flight captain, now. There was a pause, just half a second, but Desmond heard the shift in the assistant's breathing, the way she instantly recognized that whatever had just happened was serious. Yes, sir, right away. Desmond didn't move as he waited, his grip still firm on the desk. The office was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. The same clock he had bought the day he had acquired the airline, a reminder of how far he had come, how much work it had taken to get here, how hard he had fought to build something that his son could be proud of. And now, on one of his own planes, a flight attendant had just told his son, that he didn't belong. The assistant's voice returned, slightly rushed. Captain Hughes is on the line for you, sir. Desmond pressed the button to transfer the call. Captain. Mr. Carter. The captain's voice was steady, professional, but Desmond didn't miss the edge of surprise. It wasn't often that the owner of the airline personally called mid-flight. Desmond didn't waste time. I need a status update on flight 1287. A beat of hesitation. Everything is running smoothly, sir. Desmond's voice was clipped. No, it's not. The hesitation grew heavier. Sir, my son was just removed from his first-class seat and sent to economy. I want to know why. Silence. A sharp inhale from the other end. Then, Sir, I was not made aware of this situation. You are now. Desmond's fingers tapped against the desk, controlled but deliberate. Find out what happened, and put me on the in-flight call system with your lead flight attendant, immediately. Another pause, then, yes, sir. There was a click as the line transferred. Desmond leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, steadying himself. This wasn't just about Malik. This was about every person who had ever been dismissed like this. Every time someone had been judged before they even opened their mouth. Every moment that someone had been told, without words but with actions, that they didn't belong. And Desmond Carter was going to make damn sure that message was corrected. Permanently. The intercom crackled overhead, cutting through the gentle hum of the cabin. Aaron Blake, please report to the cockpit immediately. The announcement was calm, professional, devoid of urgency, yet something about it made the air in first class shift. A few passengers glanced up from their screens, their curiosity piqued. The businessman who had ignored Malik earlier lowered his newspaper slightly, eyes flicking toward the front of the plane before returning to his reading. The woman with the pearl bracelet adjusted her sunglasses but tilted her head ever so slightly, listening. Erin barely reacted. Instead, she let out a small smirk, rolling her shoulders back as if she were walking into nothing more than a routine debriefing. She had been with the airline long enough to know how these things worked. Maybe a passenger had filed a complaint. Maybe the system had flagged some minor issue with seat assignments. Nothing she couldn't handle. She tucked a loose blonde strand back into her tight bun, smoothed out her uniform, and turned toward the front of the plane with the same calm, assured energy she always carried. The flight attendants near the galley exchanged looks as she passed. Nicole, standing near the drink cart, felt a prickle of unease in her chest. She had seen the way Malik had been removed, seen the way Erin hadn't even checked the system before making her decision. And now, here Erin was, walking toward the cockpit with that same unwavering confidence, completely unaware of what she had just set in motion. Erin stepped through the narrow passageway, her heels clicking lightly against the carpeted floor. She could feel the eyes of some of the first-class passengers trailing after her, sensing something was off, but not quite sure what. As she reached the cockpit door, she pressed the call button and waited. A second later, the lock clicked open, and she stepped inside. The moment she saw the look on Captain Hughes' face, her smirk faltered. The captain, a seasoned pilot in his early 50s with graying temples and sharp blue eyes, turned in his chair, his expression tight. But he wasn't alone. A small screen embedded in the control panel displayed a live video call, and on the screen sat a man Erin immediately recognized but had never spoken to directly. Desmond Carter, owner of Skywave Airline. Her breath hitched. "Miss Blake," Captain Hughes said, his voice flat, professional. "Take a seat." For the first time since she had walked onto this flight, a flicker of uncertainty crawled up Erin's spine. Erin stepped into the cockpit, her stomach twisting the moment she saw Captain Hughes' expression. He stood stiffly, his hands braced against the control panel, his usually calm demeanor replaced by something colder, more restrained. But it wasn't just the captain that made the air feel heavier. It was the man staring back at her from the screen. Desmond Carter, the CEO of Skywave Airlines. His presence alone sent a chill down her spine. Erin had never spoken to him directly, but she had seen him before, in company-wide announcements, in the sleek promotional videos about the airline's expansion, in photos at corporate headquarters. He had a reputation for being composed, methodical, the kind of leader who never raised his voice but made sure that when he spoke, people listened. And right now he was looking at her like she was already a problem he intended to fix. "Miss Blake," Captain Hughes said, his voice clipped and professional. "Take a seat." For the first time in years, Erin hesitated before following an order. She sat slowly, her back rigid, her hands instinctively smoothing over her uniform. The screen flickered slightly as Desmond shifted in his seat, adjusting the cuffs of his dress shirt, his fingers laced together in front of him. There was no visible anger on his face, no immediate explosion of rage, but somehow that was worse. The silence stretched just long enough to make Erin's pulse spike. Then Desmond spoke. "You removed my son from his first-class seat without checking the system, without verification, and without reason." The words cut through the air like a blade, crisp and deliberate, each syllable weighted with something far more dangerous than anger, certainty. Erin's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth, grasping for an explanation, but for the first time, nothing came. Her mind scrambled for excuses. She had assumed the boy was in the wrong seat. She had believed he must have been misplaced. She had thought she was following protocol, but none of those thoughts sounded like explanations anymore. They sounded like what they really were, biases wrapped in justifications. Desmond tilted his head slightly. "You have nothing to say?" I thought there was a mistake," Erin managed, her voice quieter than she intended. Desmond's eyebrows barely moved, but somehow his expression darkened. "A mistake," he repeated it slowly, as if testing the word, measuring its weight. "A mistake is when a passenger sits in the wrong seat by accident. A mistake is when baggage is delayed on the tarmac. What you did wasn't a mistake, Miss Blake." Her throat went dry. Desmond leaned forward slightly, his voice never rising, never shifting from that terrifyingly calm tone. "What you did was a decision." The sentence settled between them, undeniable, unshakable. Erin's fingers curled around the hem of her uniform, her confidence crumbling under the weight of what was happening. "I didn't—" She tried again, but Captain Hughes cut her off. "Enough." The sharpness in his voice startled her. She had never heard him sound like that before. "You will return Malik Carter to his seat," the captain continued, his tone ice-cold, leaving no room for argument. Personally, the cockpit felt smaller, tighter. Erin swallowed hard, nodding stiffly, forcing herself to stand even though her legs felt unsteady. But before she could turn, Desmond spoke one last time. "And when this flight lands," he said, his voice like steel, "you'll answer to me." The call ended with a quiet click, but the weight of his words remained. Erin stepped out of the cockpit, her stomach twisting in a way it never had before. Her body moved on instinct, her legs carrying her forward, but everything else felt detached, like she was moving through water, slow and suffocating. The moment she re-entered the first-class cabin, she felt it. The shift. Passengers who had barely glanced at her before now watched her every move. Some turned their heads slightly, pretending not to stare, but she could feel their eyes, their curiosity, their quiet judgment. They didn't know exactly what had just happened in the cockpit, but they knew enough. They had seen her escort Malik out, had heard the whispers, had assumed their own conclusions, and now, here she was, walking back alone. A businessman in the front row lowered his tablet just enough to peer over the edge. The woman with the pearl bracelet, who had instinctively pulled her daughter closer when Malik walked by earlier, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Even the flight attendants near the galley stiffened when they saw her, their movements slower, more deliberate, as if sensing the weight of what was about to unfold. Erin's throat felt dry. She had never experienced this before. Being on the other side of silent judgment. Her feet carried her past the luxury seats, past the passengers who had done nothing when Malik had been removed, until she reached the thick curtains separating first class from economy. She hesitated just for a second, her fingers hovering over the fabric before pushing through. The contrast was jarring. The air back here felt different, denser, more chaotic. Passengers shuffled in their seats, adjusting tray tables, scrolling through their phones. The constant low murmur of conversation filled the space, a stark difference from the hushed stillness of first class. And then she saw him. Malik sat by the window, his backpack still on his lap, his hands resting on the straps like he hadn't fully settled in, like he hadn't allowed himself to. His face was calm, not sulking, not pouting, just waiting. The seat around him felt too small for him, not in size, but in presence. Erin felt something uncomfortable twist in her chest. She took a slow breath, forcing her shoulders back, her expression neutral. She had delivered news to passengers before, had handled difficult customers, had smoothed over plenty of misunderstandings. But this time, it felt different, because this time, she was the one in the wrong. She knelt slightly, just enough to be at eye level with him, and forced out the words she never thought she'd have to say. There was a misunderstanding. The words tasted foreign in her mouth, like they didn't belong there, like she wasn't used to saying them. She cleared her throat, pushing forward. "I'd like to escort you back to first class." Malik didn't move, didn't even blink. He just looked at her, those dark brown eyes, sharp and unwavering. Then, after a moment of silence, he tilted his head slightly and asked the question that made the air in the cabin shift again. "Why did you think I didn't belong?" The words weren't loud. They weren't aggressive. But they might as well have been a gunshot in the silence that followed. A woman in the row ahead paused mid-sip of her drink. A man pretending to be engrossed in his laptop tapped his fingers against the keyboard without typing anything. A flight attendant near the galley stiffened but didn't turn around. Erin felt heat creep up her neck. She had expected compliance, expected him to take his things, follow her back, let her correct the mistake quietly. But now he was forcing her to answer. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her thoughts scrambled for something to say, an excuse, a justification, anything to explain away what had happened. But there was nothing. Nothing that didn't sound hollow. Nothing that didn't sound exactly like what it was. The pause stretched, growing heavier with every second. Malik didn't move, didn't break eye contact. He was 12 years old and had more composure than she did in that moment. Erin swallowed hard. "I misjudged the situation." Malik's expression didn't change. "But you didn't ask anyone else in first class for their ticket?" he said. "Just me." Another shift in the cabin. The businessman with the tablet set it down completely now, his fingers laced together in his lap. The woman with the pearl bracelet glanced down, suddenly very interested in adjusting the hem of her sleeve. Because now it wasn't just Erin being confronted. It was all of them. Everyone who had watched but said nothing. Erin's chest tightened. She wanted to defend herself, to tell him that it wasn't like that she had been following protocol, that it had been an honest mistake. But she knew none of that would hold up. Because the truth was far simpler than that. She had seen Malik, and she had decided in an instant, without question, without proof, that he didn't belong. And now she had to live with that. She inhaled slowly. I misjudged you." The words felt hollow. Malik watched her for a second longer, his gaze searching her face for something. Sincerity, maybe? Real regret? Then, finally, he reached for his backpack and stood. The walk back to first class wasn't a victory march. It wasn't triumphant. It was quiet, steady, filled with dignity. And somehow that made it even more powerful. Malik walked through the narrow aisle with quiet confidence, his head held high, his steps measured and unhurried. The weight of the moment was not lost on him. He could feel the hush that had settled over the cabin, the thick, suffocating kind of silence that followed when people realized they had witnessed something wrong but chosen to do nothing about it. The first-class passengers who had watched him walk out now watched him walk back in. The businessman who had kept his face buried in his newspaper when Erin first removed Malik shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearing his throat as if he were suddenly finding it difficult to breathe. The woman who had pulled her daughter close to her when he passed earlier fiddled with her bracelet, her gaze fixed downward, refusing to meet his eyes. No one spoke. No one apologized. But they knew. And so did he. He adjusted the strap of his backpack as he reached seat 2A, the seat that had always been his. The plush leather looked the same, the space was just as wide, but everything about it felt different now. It wasn't just a seat anymore. It was proof. Proof that he had been right all along. Proof that he had belonged here from the very start. He lowered himself into the chair, setting his bag neatly beside him. His hands were steady, his face unreadable, but inside, a storm still raged. Not of anger, not of sadness, but something deeper. A quiet, unwavering understanding of how the world saw him. A flight attendant, not Aaron, but Nicole, appeared beside him. She didn't say much, but the way she placed a fresh glass of water on his tray table, carefully, respectfully, said enough. "I'm sorry," she murmured under her breath, just low enough that only he could hear. Malik didn't respond, didn't acknowledge her words right away, but he let them sit there. She hadn't spoken up before, but at least she was saying something now. Across the aisle, Erin stood awkwardly, her presence heavy with discomfort, as if she wanted to say something, but the words refused to form. Malik didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He had already said everything that mattered. The cabin remained quiet as passengers settled into their seats once more. The luxury of first class felt hollow now, like an expensive facade masking the ugliness that had just unfolded. Malik reached for his phone. One new message. "Dad, good, now sit back and enjoy the flight." Malik exhaled slowly, then locked his screen. He wasn't sure if he could enjoy it, but at least now it was his to enjoy. Erin's heart pounded as the plane's wheels finally touched down on the tarmac, the rhythmic clatter of the landing gear echoing in her ears while she remained lost in a swirl of regret and anxiety. She barely had time to collect her thoughts before the soft chime of her work tablet announced a new message. Without hesitation, she reached for it, her trembling fingers barely registering the cold glow of the screen as she read the terse instruction. "Do not exit the plane. A disciplinary review will begin immediately." In that moment, time seemed to slow for her. The luxury of first class, the whispered stares, even the shame that burned in her cheeks, all of it converged into a crushing weight that made it nearly impossible to breathe. As the cabin lights dimmed in preparation for deplaning, Erin felt the entire world narrowing down to the solitary, unyielding command on her tablet. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to hide away from the judgment that was now both external and internal, but she knew that defiance was not an option. Stepping off the plane was no longer within her control. Instead, she was to remain on board until further instructions arrived. As passengers began to gather their belongings and filed slowly toward the open doors, a contingent of security officers appeared at the gate, their expressions as unreadable as the masks of duty they wore. Their presence was deliberate and imposing, a silent yet unmistakable reminder that Erin's fate was sealed, that she was now the subject of scrutiny far beyond what any routine customer complaint could justify. The officer's eyes followed her every hesitant step as she moved through the aisle, her mind racing with regret, confusion, and the dawning realization that her entire career might be unraveling before her very eyes. She could feel the stares of passengers piercing through her, whispers of pity or silent admonishment emanating from those who had witnessed the earlier humiliation. Even those who had remained silent during the incident now seemed to fix their gaze upon her, as if silently demanding accountability for the injustice they had allowed to transpire. Each step she took felt heavy, laden with the weight of her own shame and the unspoken questions of everyone around her. Her uniform, once a symbol of pride and authority, now felt like a shackle, binding her to a mistake that she could neither escape nor rectify. As she neared the exit, the cold, unyielding eyes of security met hers. One officer, his features set in a stern, impassive expression, stepped forward and addressed her in a monotone voice that brooked no argument. "Miss Blake, please remain with us. Do not attempt to leave the aircraft." His words, though devoid of personal malice, resonated like a verdict, sealing her fate with a finality that was impossible to ignore. In that moment, the noise of the departing passengers, the excited chatter, even the hum of the jet engines, all faded into an oppressive silence that seemed to echo the finality of her actions. Erin's mind reeled back to the moments before, to the cockpit showdown where Desmond Carter's calm yet unyielding voice had shattered her confidence and left her exposed for all to see. Now, as she stood at the threshold of the plane's exit, she realized that her fall from grace was not just a personal failure, but a profound breach of trust that affected the very fabric of the airline's reputation. Every decision, every hasty judgment had led her to this moment of public humiliation and impending disciplinary review. The security officer's hand rested lightly on the radio at his hip, his gaze never leaving hers as he waited for further instructions from his superiors. Erin's internal battle raged on. She wanted to explain herself, to plead for understanding, but she knew that words would do little to undo the damage that had been done. The icy realization set in that this was not a temporary setback, but rather a turning point that might define the rest of her career. The passengers, too, continued to watch as if the scene before them were a live display of human frailty and accountability. Some looked away with obvious discomfort, while others seemed to study her with a mix of curiosity and quiet condemnation. A few even exchanged whispered remarks that hinted at the pervasive, unspoken truths about authority and privilege in the modern world. The weight of these judgments bore down on Erin as she was escorted slowly toward a side door, the one designated for crew members who were to undergo immediate debriefing and further investigation. Every step felt like a slow descent into an abyss from which there might be no return. In that long, unyielding moment, memories flashed before her eyes. The countless flights she had managed with firm resolve, the moments when her decisions had been unchallenged and taken for granted, the times when she had enforced the rules with an unassailable certainty that now seemed tragically misplaced. She recalled the pride she had once felt in her ability to maintain order, to be the one who ensured that every detail was in perfect alignment, only to realize that her unyielding adherence to her own biased instincts had cost her dearly. The security team led her into a small, sterile room near the jet bridge, a place that smelled faintly of antiseptic and regret. Here, the atmosphere was clinical and impersonal, devoid of the warmth that once accompanied the routine procedures of post-fleet debriefing. Erin was instructed to sit, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the cold, unadorned wall in front of her. A single digital clock ticked audibly in the background, each second marking the inexorable progression toward her disciplinary review. As she sat there, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Her mind replayed the events of the flight, the shock in Malik's eyes when she had taken him out of first class, the cold authority in Desmond Carter's words, the silent accusatory stares of every passenger who had witnessed her fall from grace. Each recollection was a blow, chipping away at the confidence she had once taken for granted, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in a way that was as terrifying as it was irreversible. The door opened briefly and a uniformed supervisor entered, his face a mask of professional concern that did nothing to alleviate the gnawing dread in her stomach. "Ms. Blake," he said, his tone even and unyielding, "please prepare for a full review of your conduct on this flight. We have documentation, passenger statements, and video evidence that will require your immediate attention." His words, delivered without malice yet brimming with the inevitability of consequence, confirmed what Erin had feared all along. There would be no easy way out, no quick apology that could mend the breach she had created. The supervisor's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, and in that silent exchange, Erin sensed that her future with the airline was hanging in the balance. Every decision she had made over the years now converged in this single, damning moment. Outside, the sounds of the airport and departing passengers continued unabated, a stark reminder that life and business moved on regardless of individual failings. But for Erin, every tick of the clock in that small, sterile room was a countdown to a reckoning she could neither escape nor delay. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to summon some semblance of calm, but all she felt was the crushing weight of her own mistakes. There was no room for excuses here, no space for justification, only the cold reality of accountability. In the distance, the murmur of voices and the distant hum of engines blended into an oppressive drone, and Erin could only wonder if she would ever be able to reclaim even a fraction of the authority she had once wielded so confidently. The review was imminent, and with it, the potential end of her career, her reputation, and her identity as someone who had once been seen as an unquestionable enforcer of order. In that moment, as she sat in the harsh fluorescent light of the review room, Erin knew that everything was about to change, and that change, however painful, was inevitable. Erin sat motionless in the cold, sterile room, her pulse drumming in her ears as the weight of everything settled in. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting an unflattering glow over the plain walls. Across from her, a laptop sat open on the metal table, the screen flickering slightly as a call connected. And then, there he was, Desmond Carter. His face filled the screen, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding even through a video feed. Erin's hands clenched in her lap, her nails pressing into her skin, but she refused to look away. She had spent the last 15 years enforcing order on flights, making decisions without hesitation, believing herself to be in control, but right now she had never felt smaller. Desmond exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the polished desk in front of him. The silence stretched long enough for the air to feel heavy, pressing against Erin's chest like a weight she couldn't shake. Then finally he spoke. "What happens next depends entirely on whether or not you take responsibility for your actions." The words were calm, measured, but they landed like a hammer. Erin opened her mouth, then closed it again. What could she say? That she had been following protocol? That she had made a mistake? That she hadn't meant it? Because none of that mattered. The truth was that she had looked at Malik and made a decision, not based on logic, not based on fact, but on assumption. And that assumption had cost her everything. Desmond watched her carefully, waiting, not for an excuse, not for a plea, for accountability. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to hold his gaze. I made a mistake." The words felt foreign, stiff, but she pushed forward. "I judged him unfairly. I didn't check the system. I assumed." Desmond's expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but She took a shaky breath. "I take full responsibility." Desmond nodded once, his gaze piercing. "Then live with it." The call ended with a quiet click, leaving Erin alone in the silence of her own reckoning. Erin sat frozen, staring at the blank screen in front of her, but all she could hear was Malik's voice echoing in her mind. "Why did you think I didn't belong?" Not an accusation, not a demand, just a question that had stripped away every defense she had built over the years, every justification, every excuse. She had spent her entire career believing she was good at her job, that she knew people, that she could tell instinctively who was supposed to be where. And in one split second she had relied on that instinct, on that belief in her own judgment, and it had cost her everything. Because she had been wrong. And worse, she had been so sure she was right. Her fingers curled into fists in her lap as the weight of it all crushed down on her. The humiliation, the shame, the deep gnawing knowledge that she had done something she couldn't take back. She had made a child feel like he didn't belong in a space he had every right to be in. Malik hadn't fought. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't caused a scene. He had simply asked a question that cut deeper than any punishment ever could. And Erin had been completely, utterly speechless. She had seen the way the passengers had reacted, the shifting in their seats, the quiet, guilty glances, the realization that they had all let it happen. Not a single person had spoken up, not one. And yet, when he had returned to his seat, Malik had done so with more dignity than any of them deserved. She squeezed her eyes shut, but that only made it worse. She saw him walking down the aisle, past the people who had looked at him with judgment when he was being removed, and then with shame when he was being escorted back. She saw the way he had sat in his seat, not smug, not triumphant, but calm, because he had always known the truth. And Erin had been forced to face it in front of everyone. Her stomach twisted painfully as she thought about Desmond Carter's words. What happens next depends entirely on whether or not you take responsibility for your actions. She had said the words, "I take full responsibility." But what did that mean? Did it undo what had happened? No. Did it erase the way she had humiliated that boy? No. Did it change the fact that she had seen him and in an instant decided he didn't belong? No. But it meant she had to live with it. And the worst part? She didn't know if she ever really could. If you were on that plane, would you have spoken up? Would you have said something when you saw a 12-year-old boy being questioned about a seat he had already paid for? Would you have defended him when the flight attendant dismissed his ticket without even checking the system? Or would you have done what so many others did? Lowered your eyes, pretended not to notice, told yourself it wasn't your place to interfere. Because that's the part that lingers, isn't it? The silence. It wasn't just Aaron's actions that made this moment so painful. It was the quiet complicity of every single person who sat there and let it happen. The businessman who peeked over his newspaper but said nothing. The mother who instinctively pulled her child closer instead of asking why a young boy was being removed from his seat. The passengers who whispered their judgments as Malik was escorted past them but stayed silent when he returned. We all like to believe we would be different, that we would be the one to stand up, to say something, to challenge injustice when we see it. But how often do we actually do it? How many times have you seen something wrong? A coworker being talked over in a meeting, a stranger being unfairly targeted, a friend being treated differently just because of who they are, and said nothing. Have you ever witnessed injustice like this? And if you have, did you speak up? Or did you stay silent, telling yourself it wasn't your fight? Let's talk in the comments. Because these moments happen every day, in airports, in schools, in workplaces, on public transportation, in quiet, everyday interactions where one person assumes, one person decides, and one person suffers for it. Malik didn't yell, he didn't fight, he didn't need to. He made the world see what had happened just by asking a single question. Why did you think I didn't belong? And now we have to ask ourselves, if we were in that moment, what would we have done?